Welcome to the Loins of History, a podcast about connecting history to current events. My name is Jay, and I'm joined, as always, by my beautiful co-host, Colin. And this week, we're going to talk about the Korean War and how that affected U.S. and Chinese relations. So just a quick recap of our last two episodes. 2 episodes ago, we talked about the second half of World War II from 1941 and the American entry into the war and how we supported both the Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party and the CCP in defeating the Japanese. And then our last episode was talking about the loss of China debate within the United States. How did communist Chinese take over the country? We saw the KMT and the nationalist Chinese as our allies, which is why we're supporting and defending Taiwan today. So with that, Colin, what are we going to be talking about in this episode?
Jay, first off, I got to say thank you for the compliments, but we both know I have a face for podcasting.
A face for audio-only podcasting?
An audio-only podcast.
No, the hair's looking great today. Listeners, Colin has great hair, I promise.
Thank you. So we'll start with a summary of what is going on after about 1950 and just kind of frame the world as it is, specifically within the United States. Then we're going to get into a summary of containment, followed by a discussion on whether or not containment was the right strategy and if it was effective. So looking at the world as a whole, and we're going to harken back to a few episodes even before the China series, going back to the history of political parties and information warfare. The Red Scare occurred after World War II when Russia detonated a nuclear weapon, and it triggered an internal debate within the United States of how did the Russians get this nuclear warhead? Are there spies among us? There had already been, if you remember, the House Un-American Activities Committee set up in the 30s to root out communists that might be trying to subvert the United States via Hollywood and the arts. There was what was called the Loyalty Act that governed the United States made federal employees sign to keep communists out of the federal government. And so tensions within the United States are high, and there's this huge fear of communists creeping into American society. That really culminated with Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism. We mentioned it last week. We talked about it during some of the previous episodes that we've done. And this is really where, for the most part, Americans were just trying to root it out. We were really afraid that there was communists among us. And then we were also afraid of this external threat within the Russians and now the Chinese, which we talked about last week. We had the loss of China. And so the United States implemented a policy called containment. So containment began with George Kennan's The Long Telegram, or Article X. It was about an 8,000-word telegram that the United States received from Moscow. And in this, George Kennan outlaid a strategy of what he called containment. Now, mind you, after World War II, it's not like the United States and the Soviet Union were just best pals. We just beat the Germans and the Japanese. They were very wary of each other, obviously noting that, Joseph Stalin had agents in FDR's cabinet he had for years. The United States had spies in Russia. They were just not trusting of each other because of their completely opposite political ideologies. So they were very wary of each other. And the United States wanted to find out why the Russians were not joining the IMF or the international community as a whole. And this is where George Kennan outlaid what the Russians were actually trying to do, and that they were actually expansionist in their ideas. And that alerted the United States and began what was called containment. So the Truman Doctrine followed George Kennan's Long Telegram. And in the Truman Doctrine, it really started with a conflict between Greece and Turkey, where there was in the United States wanted to keep communism from arising in Greece and Turkey. So they provided financial aid to both countries. And in the Truman Doctrine, it states, free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure, basically saying, like, we're going to try and help free people, i.e. non-communists, any way that we can. And most of that became through political, military, economic assistance that were under a threat, whether internal or external. And so within Greece and Turkey, this is kind of the first time we start to see it. where the United States is trying to stop the spread of communism and contain it, if you will. So then there was also NSC 68, so the National Security Council 68. This is crucial, and we're going to see this more today, too. It kind of rears its head again. In this, the National Security Committee came together and essentially came up with an economic strategy, if you will, to defeating the Soviets. So this is where they believe that deficit spending on the military and tripling the defense budget would essentially spend the Soviets to death, because the United States economy was very different. It was set up totally different than the Soviets. So we could absorb this deficit spending where they could not. And because we would increase our gross national product in the long term, we would defeat the Soviets. They just wouldn't be able to keep pace with us. This became basically a standard operating, policy up until the end of the Cold War, and then again, kind of looking ahead post 2001 with the War on Terror and the military spending. So we've had started with George Kennan's Long Telegram. You got the Truman Doctrine, NSC 68, which came out in 1968. And then some other factors that we needed to consider within containment, which was basically the containing, if you lack of a better term, or boxing in of communism. It's because they believed that there was a domino effect. So once a country became communist, they believed that other subsequent countries surrounding that country that were vulnerable because they had poor economies, people who had been subjugated or had rampant injustice would be more susceptible to absorbing communists, because once a country became communist, they would export their ideals through subversive agents throughout the surrounding nations. So they were really worried that this domino effect would occur, and eventually it'd be too much for the United States to either contain or defeat, and it would spread eventually to their allies. So what the United States wanted to do was set up satellite nations in like Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and create model nations out of them. So these satellite nations would be countries where the United States would set up military bases, places that they could project power onto through a military, and then also economics. So we've probably all heard of the Marshall Plan that occurred in Europe post World War II, where the United States basically saved the European economy in this plan. But that also happened in Asian countries. So in Japan, in Taiwan, in the Philippines, the United States spent heavily to reinvest and prevent an economic crisis from occurring, which, as we know, that's really where communists can utilize that in order to take power. So they knew that they had to prevent an economic crisis in some of these countries. And then once they were successful there, they could set them up as model nations. This really worked in Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines, like I said, and they became model nations. So now the big question is, as we get into containment, so now the military aspect comes into this. So the United States, like I said, within these satellite nations had to set up military installations to project power. And really, up until the Korean War, they didn't have to deploy too many forces in kinetic conflicts. However, that changed once Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel in Korea, which set up the Korean War. And the United States was actually tested now because they were forced to fight the communists now in an open conflict in order to protect a free and democratic nation in South Korea. So Jay, now that's kind of the synopsis of where containment began, what it evolved into, and now we're at like 1950. So the CCP is now in control of China, North Korea, which we'll get into the Korea situation a little bit in more detail. But was containment the right strategy, and really how effective was it?
Yeah. So, Colin, first, thank you for that good synopsis on containment and how that was the U.S. policy during this time, because you can't fully understand the U.S. position in Korea without understanding like the greater like diplomatic context of what was going on, because when Korea kicked off, it a lot of people were confused that we were even fighting a war over there. And the Truman administration tried to downplay it and they were calling it a police action, not a war, not a conflict. Kind of similar to how the Russians are calling their war in Ukraine right now a special military operation. Like for domestic political reasons, they're intentionally trying to downplay the gravity of what's going on. So with containment, the U.S. was afraid of the rise of communism. China, as we talked about in our last episode, had just taken, or the Communist Chinese Party had just taken over all of China. We, the United States, believed that communism was intentionally trying to spread globally, and it was. The difference is that, this Marxist-Leninist brand of communism, that founded the Communist International and this Workers of the World Unite type deal. What they didn't understand was that view of communism has its roots in Western imperialism. And we've talked about this in previous episodes. And there's a lot of irony there because the communists fancied themselves as anti-imperialists. They were pressuring the Western European countries to decolonize. They positioned them. The communists positioned themselves as these like liberators against Western imperialism. But what I mean when I say it was connected to Western imperialism is that it saw itself as a global movement that would change the face of the world. And it sought to turn all these foreign governments into communist governments. Like that's a form of imperialism. Anyway, where I'm going is we automatically applied that to China, and I think that was a mistake. So for the question of was containment the right strategy, I think we can kind of say two things that at first sound contradictory. Containment was the right strategy in general for the United States. However, applied to the Chinese context, it didn't work, and it was the wrong strategy. If that makes any sense.
I think it was the right strategy executed with a lot of blunders. And here's what I mean by that. The Chinese at the time, well, really even the Koreans just as a whole, the communists within Asia, I guess I should say. So the North Koreans, the Chinese, they were equally as afraid. They were equally as afraid of the spread of imperialism or the respread of it, the retaking of it, as we were afraid of communism. And what I mean by that is the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949. So when the Korean War started in 1950, they had been technically a nation, as a communist nation, for a year, or really less than a year. They were in an extremely precarious situation. If you look at the Chinese economy at the time, I think inflation was skyrocketing. They had really poor harvest over the past couple of years. They had just lost millions of people in World War II, in the Civil War. They had this huge demobilization of their military because they just didn't have the money. So they were in a bad spot. And it's not like they were really in a position to go fight aggressively.
Right.
Now, I think it's important to take a look back at the context as well. The North Koreans, or really the Koreans, it was one Korea at the time, occupied by the Japanese, but the Koreans aided the Chinese in Manchuria during the Chinese Civil War, specifically the CCP. So the Chinese always looked to the North Koreans and as allies because they helped them in such a critical time. And they were going to help the North Koreans should they ever need help. So I don't know if the U.S. really knew that or understood that at the time, but when you attack a little brother, big brother's going to come and help them because they viewed the North Koreans in a lot of ways as I don't know, saviors is kind of a strong word, but they helped them in a critical time in the late
Yeah.
40s fighting the KMT. They provided them
Hmm.
refuge, they provided them weapons. As a matter of fact, a lot of Korean communists helped them fight the KMT. So they had a very, very strong bond with the North Koreans. So
Hmm.
crossing the 38th parallel, which was no longer containment, instigated a conflict with the Chinese.
Yeah. I I don't think our positions are too terribly different from one another. The yes, um, like okay, here's an example of what I'm trying to say. So containment failed slash so it failed initially, but then after the war, I think there's an argument to say that it worked against North Korea, right? We were trying to contain the North Korean communists from taking over South Korea. Containment, i.e., or deterrence is another word, failed because in 1950 they attacked South Korea, right? And almost completely took over the country. Um, However, we intervened. We, the United States, intervened, and we prevented North Korea from taking over South Korea. So in that sense, like our policy of containment succeeded. The and yes, there were. I think to your point, there were blunders that took place during that entire conflict. If like Korea's the scope, then yes, containment worked with some blunders in there. But if we take China as the scope, right? And what like China's just not this imperialistic power. And I agree where I'm coming from is in Henry Kissinger's argument in his book on China is that China's not this imperialistic power. China's not trying to take over the world. Like what China's view of a regional uh hegemony is not, oh, we have conquered all this different territory. Rather, it's this historical Chinese view of performing the kowtow, right? Like it's this the other nations just simply recognize the CCP as not even necessarily sovereign, but recognize the CCP as like daddy in a sense.
Superior.
Yeah. It's hard to articulate in Western terms, but like this, like, if we go back to, these former empires, I was actually talking to a buddy of mine about this the other day, like during the Qing dynasty, Tibet, like Ti- Tibet was its own quote unquote independent sovereign country, but they paid nominal subservience to the Qing emperor. Like Tibet kind of ran its own show. Like the Dalai Lama was like there was the Dalai Lama and there's a Dalai something else I forget. Like they were nominally like they were independent, but they were still nested under this administrative hierarchy under the Qing Empire. Like that's what China views as hegemony. They're not trying to like take over the world in the same way that we were afraid of the Nazis and the Russians or the Soviets rather. When I say that containment's not necessarily the right strategy for China, it's formed on a false presupposition that China's trying to take over the world and we need to contain them. Because that's not necessarily what they're trying to do. Them taking over the world in their own view looks drastically different than what we would think it might look like.
That adds a lot of context. And I think a lot of people in the Western world need to hear that about China and understand them a little bit more, which is why we're here. Now, I would argue that containment within East Asia was actually have the scope on Korea was successful. Then you expand it out to China. It's like, well, we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. But if you
Yeah.
expand it a little further, I think it was pretty successful. And here's, I mentioned some of these model nations and satellite states. If you look at Japan prior to 1950, Japan very nearly, well, maybe not very nearly, but there was a Red Scare in Japan. There was a Red Scare in Taiwan. There was in all these other countries around there. I mean, the world as a whole the U.S. obviously boomed after World War II, but as a whole, most countries were shattered economically. Inflation was high, unemployment was high. Like that is a powder keg ready to go off for a revolution. That's what happened in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution. So then in Japan, they had the same problem. Like there were communists in Japan. They rounded them up, they fired them. Like the US had to
Yeah.
invest heavily. And that's kind of where we get the economic side of it. Greece and Turkey, I mentioned, Japan, Taiwan. We had to root them out. We had to spend to basically prop up these economies. And I think that's a lot of the criticism of containment is looking at it kind of now, because a lot of our foreign policy decisions, 70 years later, 50 to 70 years later, are kind of modified containment where we're like, okay, we have to prop up this country and this leader and this economy in order to prevent it from collapsing and turning into an enemy.
Yeah.
Getting involved at that level is definitely going to not be popular. I mean, how would you, if you're from Oklahoma, having a Texas come in and say like, you're going to have this kind of government? And I say that to be funny, but like, you wouldn't like it, especially now a foreign country, let alone somebody who's in the same country but a different state. It
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
it's not something that Americans would want. So, like other countries, you shouldn't be shocked that other countries don't necessarily like it. That we come in and we're like, we're going to prop up your economy, which is good, but then you're going to
Yeah.
do what we say and have these leaders. I think that's where a lot of the criticism comes from, because we've basically taken the same policy and just kind of modified it a little bit. Um, back to World War II and post World War II. I think saving Japan and turning them into a satellite state, Taiwan, the Philippines. We also formed, agreements with these other countries, and we actually, everyone knows NATO, to stop the Soviets in Europe. There's actually like a CIETO, so it was like Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, where
Hmm.
and it was existed until the mid 70s in the Carter administration. But it was the same thing. It was like, okay, in the Pacific, we're going to stop communism, and there's all these countries that we're going to align militarily. We signed a
Hmm.
different treaty with Australia and New Zealand. So like it was effective in the sense that, to your point, it took away China's ability to become a real regional uh, or gain regional power status in these countries where it dictated to, like it does with North Korea. Like North Korea doesn't really act without the Chinese approval. And we kind of
Yeah.
see that, like Kim Il Sung, like when he ordered the North Koreans to cross the 38th parallel and invade the South, like he needed both Mao and mostly Joseph Stalin at the time, but he also got Mao and the Chinese permission basically to cross and attack, knowing that they would support him on the back end. So a
Yeah.
long way to say that I think if we expand the scope a little bit, it was mostly successful.
Yeah. Can we kind of shifting gears real quick? Can we talk about American lessons learned from the Chinese entry into the war? So, and what I mean by that is, so the premier at the time, uh, Zhou and
Z-
Lai,
oh yeah,
Zhao and Lai. However, sorry, folks, pronunciation's bad. Zhou and Lai like stood up and was like, we like, if the United States crosses the 38th parallel, we are going to militarily get involved in the Korean War. And the United States was just kind of like, yeah, cool, whatever. and lo and behold, China gets involved. Like, can we talk about like that blunder, what that meant at the time for US and Chinese relations? Because this, like in the greater context of this whole podcast series, this is the one time that Americans and Chinese are literally killing each other. Go for it, Colin.
so I was going to say I'm glad you brought that up. So the premier, he was in, I think, Moscow at the time initially, because Mao sent him there. Obviously, like the situation in North Korea, I think Mao, Stalin, and Kim Il Sung knew that there was going to be a conflict. And Joseph Stalin, I've mentioned it before, he was much more pragmatic in his ideas on communism. Like I think he understood after a while, like going to an all-out war with the United States to expand the Soviet Union was not a good policy. Like we said, with the Chinese, they were not looking necessarily for open conflict, so they were trying to figure out the situation with little brother North Korea. So the premier was there, and he was having this correspondence with Mao. So the Chinese and the Soviets had signed what was called the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. So basically, it said, to summarize, that if China is invaded by the imperialist powers, obviously harkening back to their century of humiliation, if it's invaded, the Soviets will intervene on behalf of the Chinese. So the Chinese knew that if they were invaded, they had the Soviets to back them up. So that was a nice security blanket. And there's a question that you could ask is like, well, if the Chinese knew that, they probably weren't going to get invaded. Why risk anything by attacking the United States and North Korea? And the premier, when he was having this correspondence with Mao, was basically going back and forth and saying, like, the Yalu River, if the United States is able, or the Western powers are able to occupy to the Yalu River in North Korea, and North Korea becomes one democratic nation, they will be in range of all of these factories, all of these military bases. Their bombers will be able to have free reign in China, and we will be at a security risk. Like, we
Right.
will be under direct threat, and that's not good. Also, it makes us look very weak. Mind you, like I
Mhm.
said earlier, they're 1 year, less than a year really, into
Yeah.
one nation of the CCP in China. They still have dissidents all over China. They still have the KMT agents stirring up trouble. They still
Mm.
have warlords, believe it or not, who are exploiting the situation. And for the communists, like, we obviously look at like communist propaganda as very effective. Like, they knew that having the United States sitting at their border and them doing nothing made them look weak. It would only give,
Yeah.
and I think Zhao actually brought that out like point blank. It was like, this will make us look weak and give rise to the dissidents. It'll give them ammunition to attack us with. So not
Mm.
only is there actual bullets that could be coming at us, but there's also these political bullets and these landmines that we're going to have to duck. We cannot allow them into North Korea to cross the 38th parallel.
Yeah.
So it was it was a blunder on the United States part, in that I feel like we kind of halfway did it. Like, oh, we're just going to cross the 38th parallel and go and attack, without knowing that's going on, and without a willingness to completely finish the job.
Yeah. And let's not forget, like, that's exactly how the Japanese progressively invaded China. Was they took over Korea, then they took over a little bit of Manchuria, then they took over a little bit more of Manchuria, and then all of a sudden it's 1937 and they're at the gates of Beijing. Like, they're, from a Chinese perspective, they're thinking like, the Americans are in South Korea, they're about to take over Korea. Next is Manchuria. like, we've seen this story play out.
That was and
Like, we cannot let that happen.
that was 13 years before, like when the second Sino-Japanese war started. Like, that was 13 years before, and then the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931. So think about it. Like, for Westerners listening, that's like dating back to 9/11. Like,
Right.
most people who are
Less
more or
than that.
less, less than that, who are millennials or older, can look back at 9/11 as like this seminal moment. This changed a lot of things. Like, it's still very like real and tangible in our minds. Now imagine another country just straight up invaded and annexed like the Pacific Northwest. And that was like, hey,
Right.
this is ours now. And then started a massive war with it 5 years ago. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is like, this is very
Yeah.
recent in their minds. So of
Oh,
course
yeah.
they're going to take this very seriously.
Yeah. I think the Truman administration basically ignoring the Chinese in this regard was a combination of hubris, bureaucratic overload, and false information coming from MacArthur himself.
Ooh.
Uh, so each one of those things in turn here. Hubris. The United States looked down, like, culturally looked down upon the Asian people. Like, on the whole, This comes from 100 previous years of Western and Asian interaction where we viewed the Chinese, the Japanese, the Filipinos, the Koreans as these like inferior cultures that needed our help, right? Oh, look at we're civilized Europeans and Americans, like these people, like we can help them with their technology, we can help them with their religion, we can help them with their infrastructure, their economies, etc. Like we need their help. This kind of view of, you know, Europeans and Americans looking down upon uh, Asian countries is still very, very much alive and well. And I think that's the hubris aspect of it. Uh, Secondly, bureaucratic overload. The Truman administration is dealing with a new post World War II world order with nukes in them, right? Like, Colin, I don't remember if you mentioned this in the beginning or not, but like we were very concerned about the Soviet Union getting nuclear weapons. I don't remember if they had successfully tested one at this point or
I
not.
think they did by 1949, and that was where
Yes.
that triggered the
So,
Red Scare.
so there you go. Like it was, the Soviets had just got nukes. Um, there was a period of great instability in the world. In the Truman administration is just like I can only imagine being in the NSC. And the NSC was much smaller at this point in time. I don't know exactly how small, but right now it's a massive bureaucratic organization. We could do an entire podcast episode on the NSC and how it's changed and what its job is. Sorry, just for our listeners, NSC is National Security Council. It's an organization that falls under the White House. And it kind of got its start during this time. Anyway, so to a certain extent, from like a national security standpoint, there's got to be bureaucratic overload, right? A bureaucratic overload. Like there's just too many problems in the world to try to figure out the best way to do it. And Korea's never been up until this point a location of significance to the United States. Our main trading partner was Japan, and then it was China. Like Korea was, I don't even know if it was third place. We probably have historically cared more about the Philippines than Korea prior to 1950. So it was like it's just not that high of a priority. And then lastly was Douglas MacArthur. So this dude, I'll just go ahead and say it. Jay's historical opinion on Douglas MacArthur is pretty low. And one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of MacArthur is during the Korean War, he had like this preconceived notion that the Chinese were not going to get involved. And his like intel section in Tokyo was at sharp odds with the intel section in Korea. And like all the intel reports from the troops on the ground in Korea was, hey, we're pretty sure we're fighting Chinese right now. and MacArthur and guys were like, no, you're not. Like, there's no way. It's just volunteers.
By the way, and Soviets, like Soviet pilots masquerading as Chinese pilots and North Koreans. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, at least like from the Soviet standpoint, it kind of was volunteers. But from the Chinese, like there were like double-digit Chinese divisions. I forget exactly how many, but like, so I don't want to give the wrong or a misleading statement.
I think there's a quote that I read from a book on Korea where they were pouring over the hills like ants. It was like, just to put in perspective, it's not necessarily a pure number, but like anecdotally, Americans fighting at the Chosin Reservoir, they called it like ants coming over a hill. Like that's how many they were fighting.
Yeah, there were. So that was reality. There were a ton of Chinese, and yet MacArthur, like personally, not just his staff, it was him personally was dismissing like, no, the Chinese are not getting involved, blah, blah, blah. Because MacArthur saw himself as like a legionary commander, like in that the bureaucratic United States, like the Pentagon, the White House, Congress, like, no, you guys worry about your own deals. Like this is why um, the biography, probably one of the best biographies on him, is called American Caesar. Like he saw himself as like the Caesar of Asia. And anything that contradicted that, he completely dismissed. So what he was feeding the Truman administration and the NSC was, oh, the China's not getting involved. So the Truman administration was completely blindsided by the Chinese um, entry into the Korean War, and that's why, we got embarrassed by the Chinese. Like you talk about the CCP's barely been a country for a year. They're in no position to fight a war, and they embarrassed us on the Korean Peninsula. Yeah.
A couple of points on that. One, I agree with you about MacArthur. He was a military, I think genius gets thrown around too much, but he was extremely successful. Like the without getting too far ahead, like the landing at Incheon and some of these other, like, masterful. But he ended up getting fired by Truman, basically, and Truman stopped short of basically calling him a traitor. Like he was, I can't remember the words, but he called him out for giving bad intel reports and misinformation. We hear that a lot, but yeah, he basically stopped short of calling him a traitor and fired him. They didn't like each other politically at all. And this was like done at the height of MacArthur's popularity. Cause like after Incheon, he was like this American Caesar-esque type figure. Cause it was brilliant. But to your point about the bureaucratic overload, not only, it was almost this weird time post World War II where the United States, like you said, was finding itself with all these problems and trying to figure out how. It was like a kid, or like putting bubble gum in cracks of a dam. Like there's the Marshall Plan going on, which sending money to Europe, sending money to Greece and Turkey, Taiwan, Japan. We're sending money all the place at the same time. We're setting up satellite states where we're trying to project military power, but we're also drawing down the military. And like you think about post World War II, everybody's getting out. Like they were all draftees, everyone got out, and then we went through this reorg with the National Defense Act of 1947. Like we reorganized the military. So then we now have an Air Force. Okay, well, we got to figure out how to do that. The Air Corps becomes the Air Force. We have all of these troops that are gone now, and we're trying to plug in all these holes and project military power at the same time. So you're right. It's this kid plugging in these holes that we don't really understand. We have all of these new agencies being formed. We have these new military branches being formed, and we have all these people leaving the military. So we're in like a bad spot. It's not just like the bureaucracy was growing, it was growing and shrinking at the same time. So it was this weird effect where it became not effective at all. And that's one point I want to say is like the US, and then politically speaking, the US was in no appetite to go fight another war. Like
No,
we just lost,
we were military downsizing.
big time, to the point that, like you said, that we got embarrassed in Korea. Like the amount of troops we had in Korea was low, but not only were the numbers low, but we also didn't really train them, nor did we really arm them effectively. Like they were. And so initially, and I'll back up a minute after this to talk more about how Korea kicked off, but like when Kim Il Sung and the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, like it did take us by surprise, but they couldn't fight them off. Like they didn't have a ton of tanks or artillery, they didn't have ammunition, and there were millions of refugees flowing back, and it became mixed in with the US. So like this disorganized retreat to the Pusan perimeter was like a total disaster. It was basically just US troops. It was chaos. We did not do a good job of arming them. We'll come back to that in a second. But yeah, like not only did we not have a lot, we just didn't even prepare those few effectively to guard a border that
Mm-hmm.
that's all I want to say about that. I agree with your points, and I wanted to add a little bit more to them.
Yeah, it's the Korean War is one of the more fascinating conflicts because it's the quintessential 20th century American example of getting completely caught with our pants down. Like complete and utter surprise. Like to your point, the Korean military was nothing special, and they steamrolled us in 1950. Like to the point where we kind of just go over um uh in American history textbooks, like, you know, they surprised us, and then there was the Pusan perimeter. Like, no, 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 no. Like, let's actually talk about, like, yes, they surprised us, but like we were telling ourselves that we had, to your point, we had armed the South Koreans, we had trained them, they were able to defend their own border. The U.S. Army was bragging on how good of a job they had done with the
Does that
Koreans.
sound
There's like,
familiar?
yeah, connecting current events to today, folks. The Afghanistan army, they're perfectly good. Everything's fine. Why are they surrendering? We had no idea that this would happen. Like they're able to do, oh no, where's all our stuff going? Yeah, like it's the same stuff over and over again. Um and then like and then not only like were we surprised by the North Koreans, again bring this back to China, like we were completely surprised that China, all of a sudden, we almost make it to the Yellow River, and all of a sudden it's like, wait, where are all these people coming from? And we were just, bebopping up to North Korea, like, oh, we've just got a few more pockets, beepity boppity boopity. And then all of a sudden, like, what the? Uh, I actually had the pleasure. There's a guy from back home who was a Marine in the Korean War. This dude got shot in the face. Uh, in the story he tells us, he was on patrol somewhere, and everyone was just kind of literally like bebopping their way. And all of a sudden, he was like, the next thing I remember was I had like rolled down a hill. I was at the bottom of this hill, and I heard my buddies going, hey, you okay? It's like complete surprise. What had happened was a bullet had grazed the bridge of his nose. Like it didn't like shoot him in, like the bullet didn't go in between his eyes. Obviously, that would have killed him. Rather, it was like the bullet went right in front of his face and like hit the bridge of his nose. And it was just like the shock and the concussion and like the whiplash across his face, like he completely lost conscious, like instantaneously, and he rolled down like 100-foot hill. It like broken some limbs. Anyway, he was like completely out of the war. But anyway, the point being is like that's a good case in point where it was like we had no idea. Like not only were we surprised by the North Koreans, we got surprised again in less than a year by the Chinese. Like
why do these
people?
Why do these MiG-15s look almost exactly like F-86 Sabres? Like what? Oh man, who are these pilots that have these kind of very similar doctrinal tactics to us? Before we go into the Korean War, how'd they know? How'd they know how to build this? Because the Soviets both stole our stuff, and they stole. Well, we taught them, and we both stole it from the same place, the Germans. I want to back up a little bit, though, talking about Korea and where it should not have caught us off surprise. There was Korea was occupied obviously by the Japanese since like 1910, and before that it was a protectorate dating back to like 1905. Before that it was the Chinese, so they had like this brief period of independence. Then the Chinese occupied them. After the war, the U.S. and the Soviets decided to say like, okay, the 38th parallel will be the dividing line. The Soviets, you administer the North, the UN will do, or the US will, and then the UN will administer the South. It's interesting, like the 38th parallel was chosen. Like the US was like, there's no way we can get there in time, but we want to try and see how much we can get, and we want to incorporate the capital. So it was like two US colonels were like, yeah, we're just going to try and throw this out there and see. And Joseph Stalin respected it. Really weird. He didn't have to. He actually got to the 38th parallel way before the U.S., and he didn't go anywhere. He didn't pass it. So interesting little story.
Interesting,
But then in 1948, the South Korea under Syngman Rhee became its own country. And then in the North, the following year, they had quote-unquote elections, and it was set up with Kim Il-sung as the dictator of North Korea. During this time of 48 through like 50, when Kim Il-sung invaded, there was a ton of guerrilla operations occurring. Like, we talked about in China and in Taiwan, these communist pockets and kind of these subversive agents, whatever. Like there was actual guerrilla conflict occurring, and thousands of Koreans were killed during this time. And the U.S. was like training the South Koreans or the ROKs. We were training them. We were fighting these guerrillas. Like we knew that they were North Korean agents. So it's kind of like the canary in the coal mine, where it's like, well, the canary's dead in the coal mine. Like you better get out of there. Something's coming. Like we knew that this conflict was occurring here for 2 years, and it should have been like that should have been a warning shot saying like, okay, the Koreans, the North Koreans, the communist North Koreans have intentions of taking over the South. Like they, and even to this day, like both South Korea and North Korea view themselves, it's kind of like a China Taiwan scenario. It's like the one legitimate government of Korea,
Right.
because there was never a treaty signed. It was an armistice, like a ceasefire. So
Yep.
Kim Il Sung decides to invade, and it shouldn't have. My point in saying that is it shouldn't have caught us off guard. Like the signs were there. Like we knew the communists were in North Korea. We knew that they were trying to use guerrilla tactics. We should have known that they were going to up it pretty soon.
Right. Let's talk about for the remainder of our time. Let's talk about like more long term the lessons we learned now, like after we were fighting the Chinese. Like it's like 1951, I believe, and like stalemate ensues around the DMZ, where the DMZ is currently. And there was, I don't think we signed the armistice until 52.
I thought
So there was like
53.
53. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was like a couple years, like 2 or 3 years where, after the Chinese got involved and they pushed us back down to where the current DMZ is, it was basically just stalemate for like years.
Mm-hmm.
And then we signed this armistice and the Chinese left, and now it's just the North Koreans, etc. I'm thinking like more broadly for the implications for U.S.-Chinese relations after this. Like, let's talk about how, like, we had literally just fought a war against China.
Mm-hmm.
The entire time, MacArthur wanted to drop nukes on China
Tactical
during this
nukes.
war. Yeah. And we didn't do it. Like following this was a, 25 year period where we were like, yo, we had just fought in a war against China. We're not friends anymore. To put it one way. Like, and I say that because in 1948, we were friends with China. Like, we helped China get on the United Nations National Security Council. Like, we thought China, we were buddy, and then 3 years later, we're fighting a war against China. Like, Colin, to put it in a question, like, what do you think some of the bigger implications for U.S.-Chinese relations are? What are the implications from fighting a war against China?
One is, this is probably the biggest one. We had to take seriously a military threat from the Chinese. Like you mentioned it, like we kind of looked down on Asian cultures. I think we kind of looked down on their military capabilities. Like we could no longer afford to do that. I think we saw the effectiveness of the Chinese, maybe not as an individual, but they're 4 times more populous than we are. So they have an incredibly large army. So we knew that we had to take them seriously as a military actor. 2, I think we had to assume geopolitically that with this containment strategy anywhere in the Asian Pacific theater, that the Chinese would be backing up any communist actors or communist states. We see that again in Vietnam. So, like, 1, you have to take them seriously militarily. 2, we have to assume that they're going to be involved in the Asian Pacific theater in anywhere that a country starts to lean communist. As a matter of fact, I think Mao had a policy where, like, any country that leaned socialist or communist, they were going to back before backing the United States. And I think it was like Yeah, he was going to back any country like that, basically in order to oppose the United States. And that was like a matter of policy for the Chinese that they were going to oppose us. So we have to make that assumption that they're going to do it there. And then three, the fact that at this point we still recognized Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, and I think at the time the Soviet Union and the Chinese like weren't going to join the UN out of protest for that. So like we had to assume that if we're going to continue this containment policy and anti-communist, that they were not. This is at the period, so like 50s, 60s, early Cold War. They were not going to participate in the international community the way that they would have evolved to in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s until the fall of the Soviet Union. So I don't know. What are
Hmm.
your thoughts on that?
I like what you said about all of a sudden we have to take them seriously, which is kind of shameful that it even got to that point. But understandably, uh, understandably, like if this whole series has been like China's been kind of a mess prior to this point. You've it's just been kind of a mess. They in their own words they call it their century of humiliation. So uh, things haven't exactly been the best for Chinese, but then all of a sudden, at arguably like a period of simultaneous like weakness and triumph for Mao, like in 1949 he proclaims the People's Republic of China, so there's the triumph aspect. But to your point earlier about like they're still very weak, they had not entirely solidified their position. Their military was kind of struggling. And then all of a sudden they enter this war with the United States and in a certain extent the entire world. Like it was very much a UN mission. There were quite a few countries, not just the United States there. Um,
It's a laundry
and
list. It's a lot.
yeah, yeah, like I want to say in the 40s or
So
50s
something
of
like
different
that.
countries.
Yeah.
It was a lot. Um,
Luxembourg sent troops, and I think they actually had 2 troops die in Korea. But it's crazy. Even like
yeah.
Luxembourg was involved.
So I've actually had the pleasure of visiting Seoul, and I went to the Korean War Museum there in Seoul. And when you before you even get into the museum, uh, and you walk in, the South Koreans have listed every single name of every single person that died defending South Korea during the Korean War. They've got the Korean names, of course, which is, approximately half. But then they've listed not just the Americans, but the Brits, the Aussies, the Kiwis, the French, you name it. There's tons of them. Like from
Yeah,
all over the Turks. There's Turks that died
there were
in
Japanese,
in
Filipino.
Canada.
I think there was one Indian soldier that died. 2 from Luxembourg. You're right.
Yeah,
It's a long list.
but it's crazy. Like it was a global conflict that took place in one place in Korea, and they know that, and they try to honor that there at the Korean War Museum. It's one of the best museums I've ever been in. Cannot recommend enough going to one. Seoul is an awesome city. Two, definitely go to the Korean War Museum. It's free. And it is really cool. But so like you've got this global conflict, and then all of a sudden it's not only do we have to take the North Koreans seriously for a moment, but China, we've got to take China seriously, and I think that led to a period of um, souring relations. We no longer, at least in a certain sense, had this hubris that was like, oh shoot, like these guys kind of spanked us. Um, yeah, we've got to take them seriously.
Yeah, I think one other point I want to make about that is, and this is in my opinion, that any conflict that would occur on the Asian continent would have massive casualties. And why I say that is, if you look at the Korean conflict, either Vietnam, we'll get to that one later, but in Korea, like North Korea, I think it was something like 75% of the country was leveled. They had millions of civilian casualties. I think it was around 2.5 million. And this is North and South Korea, 2.5 million. It was one of the most heavily bombed areas, like per capita, in the world at any time, like to include World War II. Like they basically leveled um, Pyongyang, and Seoul was leveled. And even as a matter of fact, now, like if like they're always worried that Seoul's basically within artillery range of North Korea. So basically, like within the first hours of a conflict, if it broke out again, Seoul would just be leveled. Um, I say that to say the casualties would be catastrophic. And if you think about it, like in Korea, almost no ground was gained by either side. It was basically millions of people died in order just to keep the line almost the exact same as it was before. So, any future conflict that occurs, Vietnam, there's going to be massive amounts of casualties and potentially nothing actually gained. And those countries like China are willing to make that sacrifice. Like China lost a lot of people in that, like a couple 100,000 casualties. I don't remember how many died, but for a country that wasn't even their own, for this ideal. And
Yeah.
that's just my opinion.
No, you're right. The I think looking at it from the other perspective, though, not just China but Russia, also one of their conclusions from the Korean War was that they had to take the United States seriously. Um, and this is kind of a theme, I think, of other countries looking at the United States, is they test how serious Americans are, because we're not always consistent.
Every
Right? Like,
4 years.
yeah, like things change. Yeah. And
Well, one
when I
specific. Oh,
think
sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Keep going.
North Korea invaded because they thought they could get away with it. They thought that they could quickly take over the country and everything was good. Um, and it wasn't. We mentioned in a previous episode, like if you're a military planner and you think you can end the war quickly, you're probably wrong, right? Like the North Korean war planners were like, we can end this war quickly. The crazy thing is they were almost right, but because they were assuming that the United States was not going to get involved, they thought they could just take over and it would be good. We actually backed that up. Like we actually were like, no, like we are willing to spill blood over defending these democratic countries. We kind of did the same thing in Vietnam. Fast forward to Saddam Hussein, he invaded Kuwait because he thought he could get away with it, and led by the U.S., another UN coalition pushed him out of Kuwait. Slapped him on the wrist and moved on. We did it again in 2003. Like when Reagan sent people or troops into Grenada, like there's all these different examples where countries have kind of tested the U.S. willingness to get involved. There's situations where we haven't gotten involved. Like there's situations in Africa in particular where things not in our interest have occurred. Look at Boko Haram in Nigeria today. Like they're killing people like crazy. And yet the United States doesn't really get involved. So, anyway, the point I'm trying to make is one of the lessons learned from the Chinese aspect, though, is that they have to take the United States seriously, just like we learned that we have to take them seriously, which led to a stalemate, not just in Korea, but the Cold War, with the exception of Vietnam, would remain cold between us and the Soviets and the Chinese for the next, 40, almost 50 years.
Yeah, and to your point, just real quick about Vietnam, like the Chinese didn't get involved like they did in North Korea. In Vietnam, they were involved, but not nearly as much. Same with the Russians. And a specific example, I like talking about them testing us. Like one of their lessons learned. So like the MiG-15 was obviously like if you're gonna like equal terms and capabilities of like an F-86, and this is kind of where you start to see like American air dominance. Like if you've studied the U.S. military history over the past like 70 years, like one of the things that they try and do is gain air supremacy. Like the first Desert War, like we took over the air and we were basically flying at will. Um, not It's more complicated than that, obviously, but like in Korea, we lost very few F-86s versus the MiG-15s. I think they lost like 500, and they had 200 Russian or Soviet pilots killed. So what they learned in that very specific, more tactical example was like, okay, the Americans, like per unit, per soldier, they're very, very good. Like that's not how we're going to win. Like we're probably not going to match them capability for capability here. So sending ants over a hill and just sheer numbers will probably work, but they test out, okay, can the MiG-15 fight an F-86? Yes, but it's going to have this many casualties. Like we need to plan to have more MiG-15s than F-86s. So I just thought that was kind of doing some research I came across, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting that, that was one of the conclusions. So you were looking at it geopolitically, and I was looking at it very tactically.
Gotcha. That's good. Both levels of analysis are relevant.
So, Jay, I think we're at a pretty good stopping point, ending the Korean conflict and then moving in further into the Cold War. From this episode, we discussed containment, where it all started with the long telegram from George Kennan, evolved in the NSC 68, and then Truman's doctrine and policy of trying to contain this spread of communism backed by the Red Scare at home. We talked about some of the lessons learned from the conflict with China in North Korea. So I think it's going to set us up very well for next week, moving further into the Cold War.
Yeah, no, Colin, thank you for taking the lead on this episode and, helping us continue our story in U.S. and Chinese relations, talking about Korea, talking about some of the lessons learned and the implications for the future part of the story. Really enjoyed the conversation. And for our listeners, I hope you all enjoyed the conversation too. If you did, please give us a 5-star review. That's the best way you can help us out. Give us 5 stars and a review. If you do that, if you give us a 5-star review, we'll give you a shout out here in our next episode. Always enjoyed doing that. You can find us on social media. So we're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all variations of the Loins of History. And feel free to send us a message. Let us know what you want us to cover next. If you have any feedback, that is always appreciated. So with that, thank you for joining us this week on the Loins of History, and we look forward to seeing you next week.